Good evening. This is Monty Murray. I'm with the South Wake Conservationists, and welcome to our August chapter public meeting. Tonight we have a guest speaker that we're very excited about, who will be Liz Rasheed, and she's going to talk about red wolves, red-cockaded woodpeckers, and the Southern Environmental Law Center's wildlife program. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. I'm going to start with a brief chapter update and introducing the speaker. I'll give you a little more background on the Southern Environmental Law Center and Liz. And then we'll have a chance for Q&A throughout the talk. But before we do that, I'd like to also introduce Luke Bennett, who is our conservation coordinator with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. And Luke is located here in Raleigh, as well as that's where our chapter is located. And Luke is going to moderate tonight. So Luke, I think if you don't mind, you could share a few of the techniques that people can use to ask questions and that sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah, hi, everyone. My name is Luke Bennett. I'm the, as Monty said, the conservation coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for tonight's webinar. Just a few things, that we need to point out before we get started. Our speaker, Liz, has broken up the presentation into sections. After each section, and then again, at the end, you guys will have the opportunity to ask questions. If you'd like to ask the question yourself, you can click on the raise hand function located at the bottom of the screen. This will notify me, and I'll make sure you can unmute yourself and ask the question when the time is right. You can also use the Q&A function, also located at the bottom of the screen, and that way I can ask the question for you. And again, just thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your thirst for knowledge. And on that note, I'll pass it back over to Monty.
All right. Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So let me just take a couple of minutes to share with you some of the activities that we've been doing here at the South Wake Conservationists in the last month or so, and some upcoming activities. We're keeping pretty busy. Summer's a busy time. A lot of people are traveling, but we still seem to find activities that people still want to sign up for, and when they're not traveling, they typically are happy to do. So we did a maintenance on one of our pollinator gardens. We have 6 pollinator gardens around the area right now, soon to add a 7th. And we occasionally need to go in and kind of take care of them, right? Weeds and so on, and mulching. So on July 9th, we went out to Bass Lake Park in Holly Springs and cleaned up a garden that we started there last fall. So that was a worthwhile activity. We had some help from Activate Good Youth, the youth arm of the Activate Good organization, which finds worthwhile activities for local folks that want to do volunteer work. So it was really a nice partnership, and it went really well. We also did a litter cleanup, and we do those periodically, and that's part of the Clean and Green program of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. And for every, I've forgotten, is it 10 pounds that we get, that we pick up, we get another plant or another tree, 25 pounds. So that's something we do pretty regularly in terms of cleanups. We did this last one up at Falls Lake and had a pretty good turnout, given that it actually was canceled at the last minute and a lot of people didn't get the word. And the weather turned out better than expected, and we had a number of people show up, and it went great. Luke was there. On July 23rd, we had a pretty fun Eco Kids activity. We've got a program for kids that we started last year called Eco Kids, and we held Moth Night, and it was actually National Moth Week. So in honor of that, we held Moth Night again at Bass Lake Park, which is local to where we're located, and put up a sheet, and a couple of sheets actually, with black lights behind them, and just watch what are the critters that are going to show up, most of them being moths, but other kinds of insects as well. And it was pretty fun. Kids really enjoyed it, and I think we all learned a lot, and we got some pretty cool pictures. You might check out our website. So upcoming, our next Eco Kids activity, we're going to do the end of August on the 27th, and it's going to be at the North Carolina Museum of Art Park, which is a really wonderful art park here in Raleigh. And we're going to be exploring some of the macroinvertebrates and other kinds of critters that you'll find on the pond's edge at the pond at the art park. And then also we'll be looking at what, how the rest of the ecosystem works, and, kind of talk about that with the kids in an aquatic environment. And also there's quite a bit of wildlife, waterfowl wildlife there. So we'll be hopefully observing some of that, herons and so on. So looking forward to that one at the end of August. Another activity that's going on, as many of you know, we're part of the deer program. There's this deer donation program, and that is something that we support with a site in Lillington, which is just south of here. And we maintain that site, and then during the hunting season in the fall, hunters bring their excess deer that they have hunted, and they're brought there for processing or preparation to take to a processor. And it's turned into ground venison in 2-pound packages, which are then distributed to food banks for people that are, don't have good access to quality food, and particularly quality proteins. So that's a really nice program. And what's going on now is an upgrade during the month of August because of the chronic wasting disease, which is a pretty serious disease issue with the indigenous deer. And so we need to be very cautious of that, and just so extra measures are being taken to make sure that the site is sanitary and able to work around that with no food safety issues. And then finally, we have our very fun event we're going to do with the Wake Audubon Society in September. We don't have an exact date yet, but we'll be watching the Chimney Swifts. And if you haven't seen it before, that is fun. They just create this vortex when they fly around, and they create this vortex, and all of a sudden they all just swoop into the chimney and spend the night there. It's quite a sight. So that's something we're going to do as a field trip. But visit our website, southwakeconservationist.org, and keep up with what we're doing. Subscribe if you want to get regular updates. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Liz Rasheed. She is with the Southern Environmental Law Center, and that's a nonprofit legal advocate for the environment. They were founded 35 years ago, and they have 3 major parts of their mission. One is to protect the right to clean air, water, and a livable climate. Another is to preserve natural resources and biodiversity. And the third is to provide healthy environment for all. So that should ring pretty true with, I think, what we in the North Carolina Wildlife Federation and the chapters are, totally devoted to. So it's a great organization. They've had a big impact. Liz is a senior associate attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center, and she's with the Chapel Hill office of that organization. She's a graduate of Duke University, as well as the New York University School of Law, and is a contributor to the New York University Environmental Law Journal. She's focused her practice on defending wildlife, including through litigation under the Endangered Species Act and other federal laws. So tonight's presentation, Liz is going to share with us the Southern Environmental Law Center's wildlife program, as well as the work that she has done specifically to protect endangered red wolves, which we've had a lot of interest in, across the Wildlife Federation for sure, as well as the Red Caucated Woodpeckers. So I'd like to turn it over to Liz Rasheed now. Liz, I'm going to stop sharing and give you a chance to pull up your slides.
Thanks, Monty. Let's see if I can do this. We've practiced this. Okay. There
it is.
Okay. Is it okay? Sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm doing this properly. So Monty already introduced me the way that I was probably going to introduce myself, but thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Liz Rasheed. I'm a senior associate attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center in our Chapel Hill office. I have been with SELC since the beginning of 2019, so a little over 3 years. And prior to coming to SELC, I actually did nonprofit wildlife law in Colorado for a couple of years first. This evening, I'm going to tell you a little bit about SELC at first, and then talk about SELC's new wildlife program that actually just got formally started in 2021. And from there, I'm going to do a couple of case studies to go into more details about 2 of the species that I've worked on in particular that are dear to my heart. First, the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker, and then the Red Wolf. And as Luke and Monty have already said, we're going to take a pause between each section of my presentation, which I hope should be pretty clear what the sections are, so that we can take any questions and hopefully make it a little bit more fun and interactive. And then when we get to the end, of course, you can ask any questions about anything that came up before that too. And I also would like to apologize in advance. I did not prepare adequately for the text side of this, so I have a printed page of small notes. So if you see me looking down instead of at the camera, I'm sorry. So getting started here. Southern Environmental Law Center. Southern Environmental Law Center was founded in 1986. We're a 501c3 organization dedicated to protecting the people in special places of the South. We work with a wide range of conservation organizations on issues related to habitat and species protection. The mission of our organization is to protect the basic right to clean air, clean water, and a livable climate, to preserve our region's natural treasures and rich biodiversity, and to provide a healthy environment for all. SELC started small, but we've expanded our reach a lot. We have offices in 6 states across the Southeast region, as well as in DC, which you can see here. Our work is extremely place-based and regionally focused, and I feel like that really makes us leading experts and advocates in environmental issues facing our states. SELC has a few different focus areas that you can see here, but these focus areas really cover a lot. For example, even just in my work, in addition to working on our wildlife program, I'm also on a dedicated coastal team, and that team takes on issues ranging from stopping offshore drilling to promoting responsible offshore wind development to protecting the coast from overdevelopment that exacerbates the adverse effects of climate change. I'm also on a dedicated water team, which fights against emerging industrial contaminants in our region, like Gen X pollution from chemors. That team protects vulnerable communities and watersheds also from industrial hog farm pollution, and generally fights to maintain safe and healthy waters and water standards across our region. Our lawyers defend national forests and maintain public lands and help protect those lands from exploitation. They work to promote clean energy and solar power across our region and to protect many environmental justice communities from the dangers of fossil fuel use, whether that's from toxic coal ash dumps that are from power plants, or the dangers of a liquid natural gas pipeline that a company has planned to run directly through a minority neighborhood. So my colleagues are wonderful and they do a lot of great work. The specific type of work that I want to talk to you about this evening, however, is specifically our wildlife work. So SELC's wildlife program. Wildlife work has been a part of our general work in the South for a number of years, but it's only recently that we decided to formally designate it as a program area and to really expand our focus on that work. And really, that decision to expand our wildlife work couldn't come at a more needed time, in my opinion. Most of you might be aware that we're in the midst of what's being called the 6th mass extinction event. Species are vanishing from the earth at a rate faster than ever before, even faster than during previous mass extinction events, which, unlike this one, were all caused from natural phenomena. The 6th mass extinction is driven by human activity, which is primarily, but not limited to, unsustainable land use, unsustainable water and energy use, and of course, climate change. Excuse me as I shuffle my notes pages here. One thing that you might not know about our region is that the Southeast is a global biodiversity hotspot. It was designated in 2016, the Atlantic Coastal Plain was designated as one of only 2 global biodiversity hotspots within the United States by Conservation International, who produced the map that you can see on the screen. In order to qualify as a global biodiversity hotspot, a region must be home to more than 1,500 different endemic plant species, and it also must have lost at least 70% of its natural habitat. Both of those are true for the Southeast. Unfortunately, for the habitat loss component, I think that is between 80 to 85% in the Southeast. Across the Southeast, we have more than 258 species that are currently protected under the Endangered Species Act. Alabama leads the region with 146 different species, followed by Tennessee with 101, Georgia with 86, Virginia with 85, North Carolina with 78, South Carolina with 49. And those are only species that Fish and Wildlife or the National Marine Fisheries Service have actually, in fact, listed as being endangered or threatened. There are lots of other species that perhaps deserve those protections and distinctions, and many of which the service has actually found those protections are warranted, but precluded because the service has so many other high priority species that it needs to take care of first. Alabama, as I said, has the most species within our region, and a lot of those are aquatics. There are more than 550 different freshwater fish found in the southeastern United States, which is about 79% of all the freshwater fish species within the United States and Canada. 91% of the United States' mussel species inhabit the Southeast as well. And almost 1/3 of all the crayfish species in the world are in the Southeast. The Duck River in Tennessee alone actually has more fish and mussel species in that one river than in all of Europe, which is just astounding to me. And the Appalachians support over 40 different species of salamander, which is more than anywhere else in the world. One of those salamander species you can see on this slide is the eastern hellbender, otherwise known as the snot otter. It was petitioned for listing several years ago. The Fish and Wildlife Service unfortunately found that listing was not warranted at that time. They are being sued over that decision by our colleagues at the Center for Biological Diversity, and we hope that they will reverse that decision soon. Moving on. While all of this astounding biodiversity and presence of rare species is great, unfortunately, the high number of endangered species present in our region are endangered for a reason, and that reason usually is habitat loss. Habitat loss is the primary extinction driver worldwide and in the Southeast. The Southeast has exploding population rates, which puts high pressure on habitat from accelerating development. Depending on how you draw metropolitan boundaries, about half of the fastest growing urban areas within the country are actually within the Southeast region. Exacerbating threats from direct loss of habitat from development are habitat changes and habitat loss caused by climate change. Climate change can directly kill or harm species by, for example, severe drought or severe storms, but it can also indirectly harm species in a number of ways, such as habitat migration and land cover change. It's interesting, climate change is actually predicted to transform about 5% of all global terrestrial ecosystems. By transform, I mean completely shift the habitat type from, let's say, a temperate forest would become a savanna. And that's predicted to happen at only 1.5 degrees of warming, which the IPCC has predicted that we are going to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2040, even under the lowest emission scenarios in its most recent climate report. So that's 5% of global land cover is going to change dramatically in the next few decades. the Southeast is one place where this is likely to happen. While there hasn't been a really focused study on this for all land cover types and species across the Southeast, Audubon did a study looking at this in bird species. And in North America, about 37% of birds are already at a high risk of extinction from climate change. Scientists predict that 56% of the roughly 250 southeastern species of migratory birds are either moderately or highly vulnerable to climate change. And of those, about 100 are going to lose half of their range under a worst case global warming scenario, as defined by the IPCC. Coastal species in our region are also very affected by climate change. For example, by 2030, between 16 and 60% of all current nesting beach habitat for sea turtles and shorebirds in the Southeast is projected to be more vulnerable to erosion from sea level rise. And over 30 currently listed threatened or endangered species populations in the Southeast are already at risk from habitat destruction from sea level rise alone. We're also seeing this, especially in habitat loss in, for example, southern longleaf pine forest, which is something I'm going to talk about with our first focal species that I'm discussing, the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker. So one of our goals as a wildlife team is to ensure that decision makers are really taking climate change into account when they're making decisions about endangered species, whether that's deciding what type of ESA protections a species needs, or deciding to designate critical habitat in a certain area for a species, maybe an area where it doesn't currently live because you can predict that the shore is going to migrate to that area. We want to make sure that decision makers are taking that into account. As I said, I'll talk more about the impacts of climate change and how that should be part of decision making when it comes to the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker in my next section. But first, I wanted to provide an opportunity for any questions that I will do my best to answer about everything that I just covered. I can stop the share. Monty, yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question on the statistics you showed on the number of listed species. Why is Louisiana, it seems like it's almost double everybody else in terms of number of listed species?
Alabama has a lot of rivers, a lot of freshwater river systems that are, I guess, less damaged at this point in time than some of the other river systems in other states in the Southeast, although a lot of them are really vulnerable from dams that have been put in the rivers that are affecting fish species adversely. But it's mostly freshwater aquatics there, which is just a really amazing diversity.
You meant Louisiana or Alabama?
Alabama.
Okay, how about Louisiana? Because I think that was the highest, wasn't it?
I think it was Alabama on the graph, and the only reason why Louisiana wasn't on that graphic, and I apologize if I said Louisiana, was because Louisiana is not one of the states where we have an SELC.
Oh, okay.
Actually.
My mistake. Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question as well, Liz.
Sure.
So, and forgive me, this is a broad question, but how does the SELC, how do you guys like sell, for lack of a better word, and promote environmentally sound decisions when it might not be, I guess, like the most lucrative option?
Right. Well, fortunately, we have baked into a lot of federal laws a requirement to, when it comes to endangered species, at least, to make the scientifically sound decision on endangered species, as well as reviews of different federal levels of decision making. So we try our best on our end to advocate for the best environmentally sound option on the front end by talking to agencies, seeing plans for things that might be in the works, submitting comment letters on things that are open for public comment, and trying to do as much upfront as possible. When that doesn't work, if it doesn't work, then that's when we really lean heavily on those legal protections. And it's a lot of the statutes that came out in the 1970s, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, that direct federal government agencies at least to do an environmental analysis before they carry out a project, and to do an analysis of if there are any endangered species in the area that might be adversely affected, and determine how can we change this project to minimize the adverse effects to endangered species. Those are requirements that are at least baked into federal law for anything that requires federal funding or federal permitting from a federal agency, which is a lot of stuff when you think about like the Federal Highway Administration, for example, or in the Southeast, because we have so many wetlands, a lot of projects require a dredge and fill permit under the Clean Water Act. And a lot of states will have analogs to those statutes as well that have their own state law requirements. And we try to utilize those to our best capacity as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I guess kind of following up on that. So, I mean, how do you make sure, and you did answer this already, I guess, but how do you make sure like an environment, like a decision is sustainable, I guess, you know, if you were to have this great victory, and like what steps go into making sure that decision isn't reversed?
That's a really good question. And honestly, it depends on the type of project. For example, actually, our transportation team is a separate team, but it overlaps with our wildlife work sometimes. I know that we contract with experts a lot of the time for that work to really analyze this, and like planning experts who know how to best design these sorts of things to minimize runoff and minimize impacts. And similarly, we lean heavily on our relationship with experts in other arenas in which we work to ensure that everything that we're doing is really science-based and scientifically sound. As far as things being undone, sometimes that is a risk when you get an administration change. The rule that you fought so hard for might get reversed. Mm-hmm. And that is just sort of part of the nature of politics, and why there is always a good fight to fight, I suppose.
And just as a reminder, if anyone wants to type a question into the Q&A, you're welcome to do so, and I can ask that question for you if you'd like. But and just going off of what you said about the nature of politics, how do you deal with just, I'm sure you run into legal jargon all the time. I mean, how do you push through that and keep yourself focused on the goal at hand?
Carefully. Try to know who the players are and know where opportunities could afford to make positive progress in a certain area. For example, like with stopping offshore drilling, even in very Republican heavy states, the constituents on the coast were opposed to drilling regardless of their party. And so that was an area in which we really seized on an opportunity to reach across lines and try to prevent offshore drilling in the Atlantic from happening with sort of bilateral support. Yeah, some of it is kind of just, you do what you can with the work that you have right now to try to ensure that the progress that you make is something that is lasting. One of the good things about court cases and legal decisions, I think, is that legal precedent stays on the books. It isn't changed by a new administration coming into office, hopefully, because it's the judicial branch. And so a lot of the progress that we try to make in those sorts of cases, I think, like lays a foundation for future work that hopefully does even more good for the environment and our communities.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I imagine it's kind of hard to, I imagine it's hard to figure out, where you're going to put your energy into. I mean, there's so many different areas. And I've noticed that with this job, just being new myself, it's like there's so many things I want to get involved in, things that I want to, contribute to a solution. But when there's so much and you only have so much energy, it's hard to pick your battles, I guess.
It is. And I think that's part of the reason why SELC has grown and grown and grown over the last 35 years, is that there's so much to be done. And we try to prioritize, the most pressing issues in the region, but it's tough to be able to, or to have to sometimes say, actually, that's probably not going to advance our broader goals as much as we would like to. So even though I want to challenge that decision that's happening in that one small spot, I don't think it's worth the manpower to dedicate it to there. So we try to be strategic to have as much impact as we can for our region and for our communities.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Do we have anything in the Q&A, or should we move on to?
I don't see any questions here. So in case anyone has any burning questions right now, I think it's safe to move on.
Cool. All right. I have pages of notes fanned out in front of me. Hopefully I will get the share screen right again. Oh, okay.
We see
Okay, picked up where we were. Great. Okay, so the next part of my presentation, I'm going to talk specifically about one of the species that I've been working on for my last few years at the Southern Environmental Law Center, which is the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker. SELC has been following the issue for several years of a push by first the military and then the Fish and Wildlife Service to reduce the protections that are currently afforded to the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker under the Endangered Species Act. And so we have done our best on behalf of our clients to push back on that. First, to tell you a little bit about Red-Cockaded Woodpeckers. They're a small species of woodpecker that's endemic to the southeastern United States. Even though they're named Red-Cockaded Woodpeckers, as you can see in this photo, they don't usually have much red on them. A male Red-Cockaded Woodpecker, however, has a small patch of red on the side of its head that looks like a little red ribbon or cockade, hence the name Red-Cockaded Woodpecker. But the females don't actually have any red on them at all. Red-Cockaded Woodpeckers, or RCWs, as I might slip into calling them, and I apologize if I do that. They're unique from other woodpeckers in that they seek out living pine trees rather than dead or nearly dead trees to create their nesting and roosting cavities. The excavation process to make a cavity is a multi-year undertaking. It requires the birds to select an appropriately aged pine, which is usually 60 to 80 years old, and to excavate 4 to 6 inches of live sapwood while avoiding the dangerous pine resin to ultimately construct a cavity that's contained within the living pine's heartwood. Red-Cockaded woodpeckers use the cavities for nesting and roosting throughout the year once they're completed. They have a preference for longleaf pines, which produce large volumes of resin and are also susceptible to red heart fungus, which makes them easier to excavate. And Red-Cockaded woodpeckers are considered a cornerstone species for longleaf pine ecosystems that once spanned across the Southeast. The mature living pines that the woodpeckers use actually best thrive in a fire-maintained ecosystem, since regular forest fires help to maintain open mid-stories that are necessary for native plants and prey animals for the woodpeckers to thrive. Longleaf pine forests, which once covered the Southeast, are now largely relegated to isolated patches due to fire suppression and conversion to other land uses. In fact, there used to be 90 million acres of longleaf pine forest that stretched from Virginia all the way across to Texas, I believe, and it's now only 3 million acres, 90 million to 3 million. And longleaf pine forest ecosystems are now considered among the most endangered ecosystems on Earth. This dramatic habitat loss of their longleaf pine homes contributed to declines of red-cockaded woodpeckers across the Southeast, as well as the declines of other species associated with longleaf pine ecosystems, including Bachman sparrow, the eastern indigo snake, the gopher tortoise, and the dusky gopher frog. As a result of this habitat loss, the red-cockaded woodpecker was first federally listed as endangered in 1970, when fewer than 10,000 individuals were estimated to persist in the wild. That's in contrast to historical estimates that before European colonists arrived in the United States, there were actually between 1 to 1.6 million family groups of red-cockaded woodpeckers that spanned all the way from New Jersey and Maryland and Virginia down to Florida, west to Texas, and north all the way to Oklahoma, Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Today, the species persist in mostly small, heavily fragmented populations and as few as 7,800 active clusters, or that's really a proxy for sort of a breeding pair of birds and potentially their helpers. Fewer than 78,000 of those active clusters may exist today across the species range. Habitat loss is again the primary driver of this decline and continues to be a serious threat to the species today. Although, as we'll see in a couple slides, habitat loss from climate change is also playing a major role into the future. As you can see on this map, which was created by our excellent geospatial team, the isolated populations in which the red-cockaded woodpecker exists today are pretty spread out and isolated, as I said. The populations in blue on this map are considered to be stable or recovered, which means that they've met the minimum number of breeding groups that the Fish and Wildlife Service set as a goal for bringing the species back to a point where it was no longer threatened with extinction. As you can see, there aren't many blue populations on the map. There are a few populations here which are considered to be potentially recovered that you'll see in yellow, like Fort Benning, Fort Stewart, Camp Blanding. And those are potentially recovered, which they might be close to hitting their numbers, or maybe they're mostly hitting their numbers, but the birds there are still really dependent on artificial nest boxes that are placed there by the managers rather than being able to depend only on naturally existing cavity trees. Our hope is that if the species maintains all of its ESA protections, you'll see more of these populations in blue instead of the current state where most of them are in red, which means they're not hitting any of their, well, they're just not all the way up to the recovery goal numbers. Unfortunately, as threats from development and direct habitat loss continue to threaten all of these populations, climate change is creating new threats to species as well. You can see that on this map. As I said in the previous section, climate change at 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we're expected to hit by 2040, even under the IPCC's low emission scenario. That amount of climate change is anticipated to cause changes in land cover and habitat types across a lot of different terrestrial ecosystems. The study conducted by Audubon that I mentioned found that a significant portion of the red-cockaded woodpecker's current range may actually be lost as a result of range shifts from climate change. On the map, you can see the same populations that we looked at on the last slide, but the portions that you see in yellow of some of these populations will no longer be suitable for red-cockaded woodpecker habitat or longleaf pine forest at 1.5 degrees warming, which again, we're expected to hit by 2040. So they're not going to have good habitat within 20 years. The red portions represents habitat that will be lost at 3 degrees Celsius of warming, which could be achieved, well, achieved is a weird way to say it, but we could hit 3 degrees Celsius of warming by as soon as 2060 if our emissions continue to increase. Only the green areas on this map are predicted to remain suitable habitat for red-cockaded woodpeckers at that level of climate change, which, as you can see, basically eliminates the entire western portion of the population, like all west of the Mississippi, which is a lot of the genes of the species. On top of that, all those western populations tend to be on the smaller side. They're already tiny, isolated, susceptible to inbreeding depression, which is negative genetic effects from being so small and so isolated, as well as they're susceptible to stochastic events. One big tornado or hurricane could wipe out that entire population and basically erase it from the gene pool for the species. So with all of this in mind, in the fall of 2020, when the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed to reduce ESA protections for the red-cockaded woodpecker by removing its endangered status and instead designating it as a threatened species, we took issue with the proposal, primarily because the best available science indicates that the red-cockaded woodpecker is still endangered. We worried that reducing its protected status would be an invitation to reduce recovery efforts and would cause the species to backslide on the recovery gains that it has in fact made in the last 50 years of its protection under the ESA. And to make matters worse, the service proposed to replace the current protections that it has as an endangered species with a limited set of protections that would be laid out in a special rule. And we found that rule to be very, very insufficient. I'm just going to give a quick summary of some of the major problems that we had with that rule. One big problem was that it provided a lot of leeway to the military. You can see on this slide, well, maybe it's a little blurry, but a lot of the most important populations of red-cockaded woodpeckers that we have today are actually on military bases. Actions on military bases tend to involve big things like armored tank trails and machine gun firing ranges and that sort of thing. And so it's really important that those actions are carefully planned in order to avoid adverse impacts to red-cockaded woodpeckers and destroying and fragmenting their habitat unnecessarily. Ignoring that, the proposed rule would have given a lot of discretion to the military to proceed with all of its training actions without needing to get additional review or permitting from the Fish and Wildlife Service at all. And we're deeply concerned by that. Similarly, the rule gave what we found to be an inappropriate level of discretion to state wildlife agency management plans, which it didn't really define and didn't put any required conditions on them. We were concerned that that basically just gave all of the decision-making power to the state wildlife agencies, which the Fish and Wildlife Service has a mandate that it must work to conserve endangered species. State wildlife agencies, by contrast, often have mandates that they're supposed to provide recreation opportunities, hunting opportunities, etc., as well as also balancing that with the conservation goals of their state. So it's really not fair to expect them to achieve the same standard and be able and have the funding to achieve the same standard of care and recovery that is reached by the Fish and Wildlife Service when they're reviewing projects. And we were very concerned that without any oversight from the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service and without any, benchmarks that would help to make the reviews at least similar, that would just open the door for a lot of take under a management plan that doesn't even really talk about red-cockaded woodpeckers or their life history needs, biotic needs, etc. The rule was also really vague about some of the key terms that it used, which I won't go into since it's so much jargon, but sort of just picking and choosing terms that weren't necessarily in the red-cockaded woodpecker recovery plan. And we thought that it would be largely unworkable to implement the rule. So in light of all of that, we submitted a comment letter on behalf of 27 different conservation groups across our region. The comment letter highlighted those concerns and many more. And to our delight, Fish and Wildlife Service actually took those comments to heart and changed the proposal in a good way. Unfortunately, the proposal still proposes to downlist the red-cockaded woodpecker from endangered to threatened, which we still believe is not warranted under the best available science. However, the revision seems to scale back a lot of the originally proposed rules' vague provisions that would have allowed for a variety of harmful actions to red-cockaded woodpeckers, both by the military and other non-federal agencies. Although the service now acknowledges the need for continued and expanded habitat conservation, restoration, threat of extinction is still looming large for the species. Habitat loss remains a substantial threat, with the majority of red-cockaded woodpeckers still persisting in those small, isolated populations that we looked at on the map. That said, we were happy that this new proposal starts from a starting point of, rather than saying that the species has no protections, and we will create a list of some very small, discrete protections that it has, this rule instead starts from a starting point of the species will retain all of its endangered species protections, and we will have a small, discrete list of exemptions from those protections. So overall, still not warranted in our opinion, but the protections under this new proposed rule would be much stronger than what was originally envisioned, or so we hope. So while we would like to see it remain listed as endangered, we submitted comments again on this new proposal and talked about ways that they still really do need to be strengthened, the new proposed rule. But we are a lot less upset with it than we were with the original proposed rule. And I can leave it at that and take any questions that y'all have about red-cockaded woodpeckers or the rule, etc.
So we do have a question here, and this question comes from Wilson Laney, retired from the Fish and Wildlife Service, it appears here. So that's an interesting connection there. So he's wondering, is the SELC keeping a close watch on the endemic species in North Carolina called the Cape Fear shiner, especially in view of the proposed huge development in Chatham County? He says his understanding is that the Fish and Wildlife Service was eyeing that listed species for possible downlisting as well.
So yes, the Fish and Wildlife Service was recently undertaking a species status assessment or status review. I am blanking on which specific one right now, but we submitted comments on that. They're undertaking it for the Cape Fear shiner. I wasn't going to go into details on this in this presentation, but we have a lot of concerns that there was an initiative under regional fish and wildlife leadership out of Atlanta to downlist, delist, or preclude from listing a certain number of species every year. And it was just scientifically unsupported. And the Cape Fear shiner came up as one of those species that was perhaps being considered. And so we took a hard look at that and submitted comments expressing our concern that perhaps considering getting rid of protections on it was an arbitrary decision. It's still also very threatened by development in the area that is making the water quality in the small stream reaches where it still persists increasingly bad. And so that is a species that we need to continue to keep watch on to ensure that it keeps its protections as well. Thanks for that, Wilson. I can stop my share for a second to field these.
Looks like Monty has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Liz. I'm curious. I know you wrote or submitted a 40-page letter to the Fish and Wildlife Service on behalf of the changes you felt were required. Are there any teeth behind that? In other words, do you go to court over this, or are you just sending an opinion to them? Or I'm just curious to what extent you can actually influence what their decisions are and how you go about doing it.
So it's kind of twofold. In decision-making like this, the service is required to seek public input from this public comment period, and it's required to actually take a hard look at those comments to really consider them and to, in fact, respond to the substantive comments that it receives. So that's one aspect of it, is that we get to make sure that all of these considerations are, in fact, on the record in front of the agency at the time that it's making this decision. By ensuring that those considerations are on the record in front of the agency at the time that it makes the decision, if the decision that it makes is still arbitrary, that becomes something that if we were to sue on the basis of their final decision being arbitrary, that's evidence in the record of that we can point to, look, Your Honor, this was in front of the agency, this is the best available science. And they went with this stale study that was 50 years old instead for no apparent reason. The other aspect is that if we were to sue on something, oftentimes you need to have commented on it previously, or someone needs to have raised the argument in a comment letter before you bring it up in front of a court, because it's only fair to give the agency the opportunity to rectify what you see as the legal shortcoming of what it's proposing before you sue them over it. So helps us, it helps them. It's a good thing when the agency really takes it to heart, as they seem to have done here. And then generally, it's an opportunity where members of different organizations can get involved, and you can submit a comment letter as an individual on anything, or sometimes groups will send around sort of a form letter that you can sign on to, and then it becomes a statement of like, well, we had 25,000 signatures of members who are opposed to this proposal, and that says something too.
Yeah. So the teeth is the legal action, but that's sort of your last step, not your first step, it sounds like.
You hope that you don't have to go there always.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Gives you more time to work on other things.
Right.
Great. Do we have any others here?
I think we have one comment here. Well, Wilson did say to keep a close eye on the red shiner there. And thank you for your answer.
Shiner.
So it looks like we have a comment question from Lorinda. She says, I believe I recall hearing that the military bases in North Carolina were working to help the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker on their bases. How much are the military locations cooperating currently with helping in this effort?
So the military bases in North Carolina actually have some of the strongest populations, kind of like the ones that I pointed out in Georgia in the previous slides. Think that of the North Carolina Sandhills recovery population, 83% of those red-cockaded woodpeckers are actually found on Fort Bragg. And so that is very significant, and we really appreciate their efforts there. At the same time, we are still concerned that the, what is it called? Base realignment and closure initiative that I think started in the 2000s, maybe, or maybe it was before that, actually, I'm not sure. But anyway, decisions to close certain military bases and expand operations on other military bases is sometimes putting new pressures on these military bases that have historically been strongholds for these species. And so we are concerned with making sure that decisions to expand operations where they have not historically been located are being made in the best way possible, that, provides for the training needs of our military, but doesn't unnecessarily site them in a place where we don't need to be destroying nesting trees of red-cockaded woodpeckers. I hope that answers your question. I'm happy to follow up offline if not.
Thank you, Liz. I don't see any other questions here. I actually did have one. It's a little bit on the broad side, but it seems to me that we focus a lot, conservation efforts in a lot of cases focus on the individual species. Do you think that's the most productive way to go about this? I mean, would it be more helpful to kind of just scale back and say, let's conserve, protect the habitat, and by doing so, that will encompass these different species that we have labeled as endangered?
Yeah, I really think that habitat preservation is the most important component. And unfortunately, I think that it's just like a little bit more difficult to get at. But it is sort of the twin pillars of the Endangered Species Act are the species themselves, number one, and number two, the habitats upon which they depend for their survival. Species are supposed to have designated habitat that is their critical habitat, that is most key to their recovery. A lot of species don't have that designated for them. I would love to see more of that, especially across the Southeast, because it creates sort of additional flags, signals, protections of before you do something that's going to adversely impact this area, and analyzing the area itself. Will it reach a certain threshold of harm? And if so, if it's a federal action, that gets prohibited. I think that sometimes species like the Red Caucated Woodpecker that are so iconic for the longleaf pine forest are a way to get at the larger habitat protections for that ecosystem. They need the same fire maintained longleaf pine ecosystems as, like I was saying, the gopher tortoise, the dusky gopher frog, many other species too. And so by looking at it through a lens of this one species and its protections, it actually often has ripple effects that are really essential for other species that inhabit that area as well.
Yeah, I agree. I've never really questioned it too much, just because it seems like it's still serving that purpose of habitat protection, even if it is through, like you said, the lens of one species. Yeah, thank you for answering my question.
Sure. Yeah, and I take the point that I would love to have just habitat listed and protected, but this seems to be our best way of doing it right now.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. So I'm looking through. It doesn't seem like we have too many. Doesn't seem like we have any more questions. So Liz, if you want to keep chugging along.
All right. We will go next to red wolves, where my notes are even bigger. I'm sorry if you can see my paper. Okay. Okay. So the next part of my presentation is about endangered red wolves. Red wolves are arguably the world's most endangered canid species. They're slightly smaller than gray wolves, but larger than coyotes. And a common piece of misinformation that gets spread around is that they're not real wolves, they're just coy wolf hybrids that are a cross between gray wolves and coyotes, and that is false. A report came out in the spring of 2019 by the National Academy of Sciences, which definitively said, based on a thorough review of all the literature and genetic information that's currently available, that the red wolf is its own taxonomically valid species that diverged from coyotes and gray wolves about 55,000 to 100,000 years ago. So they're their own species, and they've been their own species for a long time, and they are protected under the ESA for good reason. As you can see on this map, red wolves once ranged across the southern and eastern United States. The historic range is in yellow here. But unfortunately, habitat loss and predator control programs extirpated the red wolf from much of its range, and the species was listed as endangered in 1967. By the 1970s, the species was really teetering on the brink of extinction, and the Fish and Wildlife Service decided to proactively capture the remaining red wolves from the wild and begin a captive breeding program to try to build up the population numbers to reintroduce them to the wild again before they were all gone. The individuals that they captured, the founding stock, ended up being only 14 wolves, from where you can see the source population highlighted there. And after that happened in the 70s, the red wolf was actually declared biologically extinct in the wild in 1980. The captive breeding program was pretty successful. And by 1987, in support of the mandate under the Endangered Species Act to conserve and recover species in the wild, Fish and Wildlife Service decided to reintroduce populations of the endangered red wolf into the wild in North Carolina. They first started with introducing 4 pairs of red wolves into Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, which you can see on this map, in 1987. And as the red wolf population grew over the next decade, really, the service expanded the red wolf recovery area, and it eventually came to include the federal, state, and private lands spanning 1.7 million acres that you see on this map of the red wolf recovery area here. One of the reasons why this area was chosen is that this peninsula is really bordered by water and was thought to be isolated from coyotes, which were creating and increasing. Their presence was growing across the eastern United States at that time. Unfortunately, by the 1990s, they also had a presence in North Carolina. So backing up a little bit, the program started in 1987. They made a 5-year review in 1992 and found that it was really a success and they wanted to keep it going. In the 1990s, more coyotes started moving into the area. And in 1999, to keep managing the program for the recovery of the red wolf in the wild, the Fish and Wildlife Service started undertaking a adaptive management program to sterilize and trap coyotes. And this addressed the threat of hybridization. When there are not enough red wolves present in the wild for red wolves to mate with other red wolves, they are known to interbreed with coyotes. And this creates hybrid litters, which are not doing any favors to increasing the endangered red wolf population number. So that's undesirable. When you trap, sterilize, and re-release a coyote, however, that coyote will continue to hold territory from other coyotes, but it won't produce hybrid litters. And the hope is that eventually that coyote can be displaced by another red wolf that will then, be able to mate and produce red wolf litters. So that was a fantastic effort that the Fish and Wildlife Service began undertaking in 1999. They continued with the red wolf releases from the captive population into the wild population. The most successful method of this ended up being pup fostering, where young red wolf pups from captivity are placed into wild litters and reared in the wild by a wild set of parents. And so they really get to learn those skills that are necessary to survive out there in the wild from the get-go. And they have a higher survival rate than captive wolves who are raised around people and in a small enclosure that are later introduced to the wild. So from 1987 through April of 2014, a total of 134 red wolves were released by the Fish and Wildlife Service into this red wolf recovery area. And as a result of these management efforts, the red wolf population maintained pretty large and stable and over 100 wolves for over a decade from 2002 to 2014. The program was really considered to be a remarkable success, and it in fact came to serve as the model for other predator reintroductions around the world, including wolves out in Yellowstone. Unfortunately, there were also threats to the red wolves that were present over the years. Vehicle strikes, both captive wolves and wild wolves. Gunshot mortality became an increasing problem. And then the most recent big problem that they faced was actually the Fish and Wildlife Service itself. You can see this graph that I have here. In November of 2013, there were an estimated at least 100 red wolves in the wild. But as you can see where the green line starts to really fall off here, that number fell to 50 to 75 wolves in 2015. It fell some more to 45 to 60 wolves by 2016. And by 2018, it was down to just 24 wild wolves. This precipitous decline in the population coincides in time with a dramatic change made by the Fish and Wildlife Service in its management strategy. So beginning in 2014, without really formal review or consultation, the service stopped releasing red wolves from captivity into the wild, including through its pup fostering program. They also stopped actively managing the threat from hybridization with coyotes. And they also started authorizing the killing of red wolves that weren't threatening the lives or livestock of people by private landowners. Southern Environmental Law Center, on behalf of our clients, the Red Wolf Coalition, Defenders of Wildlife, and the Animal Welfare Institute, filed suit over these changes in 2015. We allege that those changes violated multiple components of the Endangered Species Act, and the federal court, the Eastern District Court for North Carolina, found that the abandonment of these known conservation measures and the resulting decline in the population did in fact violate the Endangered Species Act, numerous components of it. The court also issued an order in 2018 that enjoined the Fish and Wildlife Service from authorizing the removal or killing of non-problem red wolves. And the court even went so far as to find in its November 2018 order that the population declines of the wild red wolf population can be traced directly to the actions and legal violations of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So after that happened, we hope that the Fish and Wildlife Service would recommit to its previous recovery efforts by starting to release wolves again and starting to manage the coyote population again. That didn't happen. Neither of those things actually happened, and we waited from the fall of 2018. Nothing happened in 2019. It got to be the fall of 2020. Still nothing happened. To the contrary, the service in that time period actually doubled down on its decision not to release wolves and created a new policy where it said that it actually never had the legal authority to release all of those captive wolves that it had released during the time of the program beyond the first few that it released. And so pursuant to that lack of legal authority, they would not be releasing any more captive wolves into the future. We thought that that policy violated the Endangered Species Act and other laws, and we filed suit over that in November of 2020. I should also highlight that during that time, the population continued to drop. It dropped to as few as 7 collared red wolves by that November when we filed our lawsuit. We challenged the service's assertion that it could not release captive wolves into the wild and its failure to manage generally for the recovery of the species. And that case is still pending a final decision or final resolution right now. But a few months later, in January of 2021, we were actually able to obtain a preliminary court order, which ordered the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a plan for the release of captive red wolves into the wild. And pursuant to that plan, captive red wolves were in fact released into the wild in early 2021 and again in early 2022 for the first time in 7-8 years. And we're now entering into the third phase of that release plan, which the Fish and Wildlife Service is supposed to file with the court by the end of this month, really. Not all of the releases have been happy ending stories. It's kind of inherent in a experimental population or any reintroduction where you have so few animals that you have to be releasing captive animals into the wild that not all of those animals make it. So similar to the very start of the program, we had some mortalities from vehicle strikes, some mortalities from gunshot, and some wolves that just seemed to be too habituated to humans to be able to thrive in the wild, that for their own safety were captured and returned back to captivity. A really high point and bright side of these efforts, though, is that after there not being any litters of wild red wolves born in 2019, 2020, and 2021 for like the first time since 1990, as you can see on the graph in front of you, we finally had a litter of wild puppies that was born this year, this spring, around Earth Day. And there were 6 pups, and as of July, they are all still seemingly in good health, and we are very, very hopeful that that will, be a start for the population to begin to increase again and really get a foothold again. So the population right now is around 12 wolves that have collars on them, not counting any of the pups, not counting there were also 4 pups that were fostered into a hybrid litter last spring, which at least 3 of those are in good shape right now. And while the outcome of the case is still to be determined, we're very hopeful that this recommitment to red wolf recovery that we've seen recently as a result of our legal action will actually continue into the future, and that we'll be able to see the wild red wolf population really start to regain a foothold and thrive again in North Carolina. So I think that that's all that I have here, and I'm happy to answer questions on wolves.
We do have a question from Bob and Regan Brown.
Sure.
They said, don't you think the 2015 change by the NC Wildlife Resources Commission that allowed night hunting of coyotes had a major impact on the decline of the red wolf population?
Yeah, so I decided to present an abbreviated version of this to try to fit it in a less than 15 minute window, but that was something that the Southern Environmental Law Center filed suit over, challenging that decision. At the time, there was a settlement on that decision. I can't really speak to the exact impacts of that decision, but that was certainly one of the concerns that were expressed in the claims that the Southern Environmental Law Center alleged at that point in time in that lawsuit, which, as I said, settled out of court, I think. Yes.
So I have a question for Monty.
Yeah, I'm just curious on what was the, or do you know, or what is your sense of, what was the motivation of, I guess it was the Fish and Wildlife Service, right, that reversed their position a number of years ago, right, and stopped the good programs that were going. What was their motivation for doing that, if you are able to answer that? And maybe a little more delicate, who stood to gain from such a decision to reverse that policy?
I can't speak to the motivation necessarily of, someone outside of myself, but at the time there was some vocal opposition by a minority of landowners in the area, even though surveys show that very broadly the public in North Carolina and in the surrounding counties support the red wolf recovery program, and it's very popular broadly. There are and were some few vocal opponents to it, and honestly, for the decision making at a higher level, I can't speak to that, sadly.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Doesn't look like we have any more questions. Oh, wait, here's one. This is again from Bob and Regan Brown. They say, ranchers and farmers don't like wolves or coyotes. Do you really think putting more wolves into the same area will work, as opposed to putting them into a fenced, protected area like the Savannah River Lab?
Well, I think that this is an area where the program has been shown to be successful in the past, which is more than we have as evidence for any other area. And the Fish and Wildlife Service has a duty to try to recover the species in the wild. This is currently the only area where they can do that. And as I said, there's broad public support for this program. So I think that the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as groups like the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, are trying to work with local landowners to create more partnerships to find ways to coexist peacefully, because the data actually show that red wolves have not been a source of depredation to the extent that people think that they are at all in the area. I hope that answers that.
And I know this is kind of talking about like next steps maybe, but once, say that the red wolves were to gain a footing in that region, is there plans to extend beyond just that one location?
So I wish that I knew. There has been a new draft of the Red Wolf Recovery Plan. A new recovery plan is supposed to be coming out this year. They're actually required to have a revamped recovery plan by the end of February 2023. So I think that possibly we'll see then if there are more concrete plans on the table for other sites that Fish and Wildlife could be considering in the future. Although I think that all sites are going to be susceptible to the same problems that we already see here. So if we can't solve them here, I'm not sure. There's not really good reason to think that try again somewhere else is necessarily the answer.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you. I don't see any more questions. If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand or place it in the chat here. Liz, did you have any more slides to go through?
That was it, actually.
Okay.
I think I had like a couple more pictures of wolves, but the puppies are the cutest ones, so we can leave
Yeah,
it
and I
at that.
really enjoyed looking at the maps and the graphics. Those were very interesting.
Thank you.
Especially the one where you could see like you could see the red wolf within the map itself. I thought it was pretty neat. I didn't see it at first. I guess that kind of just as a wrap-up question. So, I mean, what can regular citizens do to become more aware and help push the case for wildlife and habitat?
I think that being parts of advocacy organizations, you can sign up for newsletters that keep you informed and sign on to different things as as strikes your fancy. But there are lots of good grassroots organizations, local organizations, and regional organizations that are tailored towards protecting southern wildlife that can help keep you informed and that create opportunities for involvement as well.
Looks like we have a comment here from Wilson. He says, thanks for all the excellent work that the SELC has done and continues to do. It truly takes a village, and the SELC is a key member of the conservation community.
Thank you, Wilson. That means a lot.
Yeah, and I want to echo that. First of all, thank you, Liz, for sharing this really important information with everybody. I know it was fascinating to me. I have a lot better understanding of the kind of work that you do and how important it is. And we're 100% behind you. Anything we can do as a chapter or as an organization to help the cause, we're here and we would love to do it. But thank you for a wonderful presentation. I know everybody was definitely very engaged and interested in what you shared tonight. And I thank you very much. And please continue to fight the good fight.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz.
And to everybody else,
Yes.
thanks for joining tonight. Luke, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I could talk about red wolves for a long time, but I probably need to get some dinner here, so I'm okay.
We'll schedule you for a separate webinar then.
Yes. Agreed.
All right. I thank you again, Liz and Luke, and everybody. Thanks for coming and have a good evening.
Thank you.